And we're recording. Hey, Sjors, how are you?
Hey, Aaron. Not bad. How
Switching
about
to
you?
English. Switching to
Yeah,
English, which feels slightly awkward, but
it's weird, but it's for the audience, if there is any.
yeah. So
I
we're
like how
both
we're
in
doing the social distance here.
Utrecht. Yeah, exactly. We're both in Utrecht, right? You're in Utrecht as
Yeah,
well.
yeah,
Yeah. So I kind of know what's going on in the Netherlands, and I know what's going on in Utrecht, but still, I want to have you on in part because I want someone on from the Netherlands because I think what's happening in the Netherlands is actually pretty interesting. Uh, compared to other countries, and just they do have a pretty, I don't know if it's a unique policy, but at least they're being pretty explicit about it in a way. And and you've been following it very closely, so I want to hear your perspective and hear your take on what's going on over here. So maybe we can start with a sort of recap. So what has been happening over the past weeks, months in the Netherlands with the whole Corona thing?
yeah. I mean, from what I remember, and I guess because it feels longer now, it started with this news from China, and then it became news from Italy, and I think that's sort of when government started to signal that maybe this thing will come here as well. But nothing, pretty much absolutely no measures until we had the first case. And even then, I think they still said, well, it's contained because we're tracking everybody. And then at some point, so, well, we're tracking most people, but and then it's like, we're really not tracking anyone anymore. So they tried a light lockdown on the province of Brabant in the south, and then about a week later, I think they started asking people nicely not to shake hands. That's when the prime minister went on TV and like awkwardly shake the hand of the health professional afterwards, and that became a nice meme. And then I think less than a week later, it got pretty serious, and they started taking strong measures like closing a whole bunch of things, but not the schools. And there was a lot of arguing about that. They closed the schools too because half the schools were closing themselves. So it's like, okay, maybe we should just tell them to close, um, except for taking care of children of the essential professions, which is like a large list, and they're debating that list, and.
Yeah, there was a
And
very
then
light-hearted touch for quite a long time. You were, I think you were paying attention already when
it
it was
still
going.
is, right?
I
I
agree.
mean, yeah,
I agree
relatively to say Italy.
for sure. Yeah, but it was noticeable, very noticeable how sort of laid back the Dutch government was, and how laid back the advice was, and the information. It was all very sort of laid back, and I was surprised about this at the time. I didn't really understand why they
I,
were being
I think
so
they were
relaxed
look
about it.
because I think they were seeing it as just a flu, just a really bad flu. But they just were using the standard plans that they have for bad flus, and I think then they got this paper or these policy recommendations about herd immunity, and they probably read that, but just sort of half-assed read it, and not really thoroughly think it through. And then when they did start to think it through, like looking at what kind of numbers you might be looking at, they're like, maybe that's not a good idea. And so now they're in between, sort of in between. Do we really want to extinguish this thing, or do we want to have some sort of group immunity light? And so now we have an intelligent lockdown, as it was called yesterday. They're really confused, I
Well,
think.
they've said they're going for group immunity, right? That hasn't changed, has it?
Yes, it has. So, well, different kinds. So the group immunity was explained initially by the prime minister and others as, okay, 70% of the country needs to get this thing, and then we're good. But as people figured out, that's just a really bad idea, and so it
So
was
hang on,
changed.
let's stop there for 1 second and explain why that is a bad idea. Why you think that's a bad idea, or why do people think this is a bad
Well,
idea?
if you're looking at even a few percent of people getting into the intensive care, then you're just looking at a completely overloaded health system.
Yeah.
So from
So
that point of view, it's not possible. And then there's all sorts of unknown factors about long-term damage, and the immunity itself might not even work.
yeah, right. So we of course don't have the exact numbers yet on how many people that get this virus actually go to the ICU. There are estimates, but it's all sort of still a little bit vague. But some of the estimates are like 5% of people, like 5% of cases go to ICU. And if you do the math on, how many people in the Netherlands would have to get this for herd immunity, then it's like 10 million people. So then 5% is 500,000 people, while we have 2,000 intensive care beds, right? That's
Or
my
even
sort of
less.
back on
Yeah.
the napkin math, which makes me think what are they thinking? How's this?
And you have to spread it out linearly, right? People have to spend 2 or 3 weeks on it, and then spend God knows how long, like reviving.
Yeah.
You don't just walk out of the IC and you're like, okay, I'm fine now. It takes weeks.
Right,
Longer.
exactly. But what you're saying, because I may have missed this then, is that they have come to this realization. My impression was they haven't even realized this yet, but I kind of
No, they did, but they didn't come to the ultimate conclusion. So they within a few days, people were saying this herd immunity thing is insane. And the RIVM, the boss, sort of the health, I guess the Dutch CDC, he explained to the parliament folks Wednesday morning, I think last week, that when he said herd immunity, he meant more that herd immunity helps. So even a little bit of herd immunity helps with the other measures. It's not that we want to have the whole country go through herd immunity, but to have a couple of people who are immune kind of makes things easier. But it's kind of so that's what I mean with herd immunity light. But then it doesn't make any sense anymore, because you'll never, you'll still need to keep taking measures forever based on the reasoning there. Because what the prime minister said initially was there's 3 scenarios. He really went on TV and explained all 3 scenarios, which is kind of nice. He said first scenario is we go for this herd immunity thing, which he then explained either correctly but changed his mind, or he explained it wrong. And then the second scenario, but that scenario is like, okay, second scenario was just do absolutely nothing. So just let the whole thing flame. And that was, really bad. But you would get a lot of immunity. And the third scenario was a complete lockdown. But then he sort of took the most pessimistic interpretation of the lockdown and said, well, we'd have to do that for years until there's a vaccine. And as soon as we get rid of the lockdown, the thing just comes back and we start all over again. So there's a lot of problems with that reasoning. But at least he presented the options. But then, and it seemed like he was going for option 1, which we thought was this 70% herd immunity, but that was dropped. So now we're not doing option 1, and we're not doing option 2, and we're not doing option 3. So it's not really clear what we're doing. We're doing probably something that is relatively sane, though, in practice.
Right. So I missed this then. That's interesting to hear. I missed that they sort of backtracked on this point. And I guess the same thing happened in England. I'll have someone from England on the show in a couple of days, where they sort of came to the realization that herd immunity is going to come with like 250,000 deaths or something. And then they realized that's not really a good idea after all. But then
So that's what I mean with like a half-assed way of reading these papers. So I think what happened is the Ferguson and others wrote a model, and they looked at what happens if we let this thing spread, what happens if we try to contain the outbreak a little bit, and what happens if we do a lockdown. And what they showed was that if you do a lockdown, the thing just comes back a little bit later. And that inevitability, and if you let it, if you don't do anything, it's too fast. So they kind of said, okay, we have to do this in the middle solution, which then was interpreted as herd immunity. And that paper, as far as I know, is used by everyone. If you looked at the technical briefing that they gave to Parliament, you could see the slides, and they showed the same charts.
In the Netherlands?
Yes. So they're all thinking...
This paper was made by British RIVM, basically, I think, right?
No, I think it's Imperial College.
Oh, okay. And they've used this for the Dutch policy as well now? Yeah. Or they've read the paper?
Yes, but what's not entirely clear to me is what the models are doing. But it may even be true that they're kind of collaborating. Like these scientists are all sort of working on the same paper. I haven't done the LinkedIn reading yet of who is doing what. But my impression is that they're essentially using the same model.
Okay, so
And
now we're in this sort of half-assed state where it's not clear what the strategy actually is. That's what you're saying, right?
yeah, it's not. But if you look at the actual measures, those kind of exist outside of a strategy too, right? Because if you look at the actual measures now, the goal is to keep everybody 1.5 meters away from each other and to prevent any super spreader type of situation. So there are no festivals and no meetings above 100 people, but everybody's supposed to work from home. And last weekend, lots and lots and lots of people went to the beach and national parks, and so they had to take some stronger measures. So now we are in this intelligent lockdown, as it is called.
Yeah,
And
we're very close to an actual lockdown, and our prime minister said, like, if this doesn't work, full lockdown would be the next step,
yeah,
right?
but I'm personally quite skeptical about whether a full lockdown is more efficient than an intelligent lockdown, because if you keep people physically in their home, they're definitely more than 1.5 meters from each other, but you're adding a massive restraint to people. So if you just, and you still have to do street surveillance to enforce that people stay home. So if your goal is just to enforce distance between people, you have the same surveillance need. You still need to look at the streets, what people are doing. But the nice thing is you don't have to ask them what they're doing. You just tell them to keep a distance. You don't have to show a form, which just means you have police touching everyone essentially, which is not good because then the police becomes the super spreader.
Right.
So I think we're as close as to a lockdown as you can get in terms of effectiveness, probably. And I think even going beyond it is becoming ethically so dubious that it might just not be worth it. But
Yeah.
we'll see. This is the natural experiment that we're still doing. Like in a few weeks, we'll know whether this works just as well as Italy or not at all, and we're completely screwed.
Yeah. So do you think the plan now is to get the virus out of the country?
I think the plan now is to get the number of cases down as much as possible without completely crippling the economy. And as long as the government has this AAA rating and the ability to borrow money for free, it can basically bribe anyone it gets in the way of. So basically, any company that has to shut down just gets paid for it. Everybody who's fired gets 90% of their last salary. That'll work until the AAA rating goes away. But at the same time, if this policy, seems credible, then investors might indeed think, okay, this government is not incompetent, so we'll just keep, giving them free money. But I'd be worried about a situation where the AAA rating disappears and the government cannot compensate, cannot essentially bribe everyone to stay home, because they're really just throwing lots and lots of money at people
Yeah.
staying home.
Before we get there, do you actually agree with the current policy? Do you think this is the right policy and this will solve
I
it?
think the way it is now is as good as it gets. There's a few things that you could do better, like you can close a few more borders, maybe shut down more planes, but the planes are pretty empty. So I don't know. I think it's good enough, but we should have done this. It's good, but 2 weeks too late, and that's the recurring theme. If we'd done this 2 weeks ago, it just would have been better. I think they closed flights from Austria yesterday. It's like, okay, why not a month ago? And why are there still flights from the UK despite what we're seeing from there?
Yeah. Well,
Being
do you think it could have been done a month ago? That's because I do agree with you. Like all of these measures should have been taken a month ago. But then the question is,
I
would
think
Dutch people have, gone along with that?
no. So this brings the really nasty problem of politics and reality. You have to have a number of dead people and like scared people, scared hospitals, and emergency calls from doctors in your own country before you're willing to do it. So I don't think they could have done what we're doing now 2 months ago. It's not possible. But they could have. I think they could have done it faster. But because I think it took a long time for the government to decide that they really wanted to do this, and that and that they needed to start convincing people that it was necessary.
Yeah.
So I think it could have been done faster, and I think we know from the Chinese numbers that there were some estimates that if they'd done it a week earlier, it would have been like 90% better, and 2 weeks earlier, 95% better. So 1 or 2 weeks earlier really, really matters.
Yeah, I agree. About the policy, so the policy is one thing, and I do think they were a bit too late. And but the other thing that has been bothering me a lot is not so much, or that's bothering me a lot more even, is not so much the policy itself, but the information we're being given.
Yeah, this is
Uh,
really bad.
the information about the virus, the information about the policy and the thinking behind it. It's very intransparent. We just have to sort of blindly trust the experts. And then the information that we're getting on the website of RIVM, for example, is wrong, or at least very questionable. Like, how does the disease transmit? And like, these things are at best questionable, I would say. At best, uncertain, and they're given a very certain answer on something they can't be certain of. Do you agree with this?
Yeah, it depends on which information, right? I mean, they are experts on a lot of these topics. So they recently published a study about mask reuse, which is targeted at hospitals, and I would just trust that study, no problem. But when it comes to communication to the general public, I think they're almost just don't have experience with it, maybe, just to to give practical advice. But I've seen some of it even on television, which is just crazy. So they were talking about people were asking, "Can I still fly somewhere?" And they said, "Well, the air in planes is filtered, so yes, it's safe." So that's ridiculous because if you're sitting next to somebody who's sick, it doesn't matter that the new air is filtered. You're still going to get sick. So they were definitely you know not good at interpreting uncertainty, and
Yeah,
that is
well,
the recurring theme with a lot of things, like how much distance do you keep, or what about maybe a better example with the children, whether the children are contagious or not. There's some studies that suggest that maybe they're not,
right.
but it's not anywhere near certain. And the downside, if you're wrong, is pretty horrible.
Yes.
So they're still saying it's fine for kids to play outside.
Yes, they're still saying that. Well, another example would be, for example, when you are contagious and when you aren't. Like, the information on the website made it very, like, presented as a matter of fact that you're only contagious if you have symptoms.
Yes,
Well,
even though it's a fact that that's not true and that's been known for months. So
exactly. That's why I said, like, questionable at best, or just wrong. And I find it very strange or concerning that we're just seeing these very wrong
it
things being
is.
presented by this sort of official health institute in the country. That's concerning to me.
I think after the dust settles down, there's going to be some studies in it. We have the OVV, it's like this organization that investigates airplane crashes and uh, like prison fires and all these kind of things. My guess is they're going to investigate this thing too, and my guess is they're going to find a lot of problems. One of them might be that somebody staffs. You have communication employees, right? That's a special job. People who go on TV, usually not the actual experts, and they get talking points, and they probably just get really bad talking points. Maybe there's another department that makes the talking points that there's that type of miscommunication.
Yeah. So before we started recording, you were programming something, or you were puzzling with something about this Ferguson report, I think.
Well,
I'm not sure.
I wasn't programming. So the thing is, we have this model from Ferguson, right? Which shows these really pretty charts, and you can read the paper, but it just talks about a model. And but I'm a software developer, so I want to see that model, see the code, see if it's actually doing what the paper says it's doing. And then we have a paper by Nassim Taleb and his friends from the New England Systemic Risk Institute. They're kind of doing doomsday calculations on all sorts of things, and they were absolutely brutal about this Ferguson paper, saying,
Right.
"Hey, they're terrible." Well, do you want to actually read the feedback thing, or I don't
No,
know? I
I'd
have it
like you
here.
to explain it if you can.
Yeah, I don't know all the criticism by heart because it's a lot, but one of the biggest problems, I think they're saying, is that this model assumes a spread of R, an R0, and they've tried different values of R0. I think they've tried a little bit of variation around it, but they haven't tried any extreme variations about it. And the thing is, what happens is you have one person who infects on average two people, and then on average, you get four, etc. But the question is, what is the distribution of that? And if And if you assume it's some really nice, Gaussian curve around 2, you get very, very different results than when it's a very fat-tailed distribution. And a fat-tailed distribution, what that means is that you might have 1,000 people who don't infect anyone and one person who infects 2,000 people. That's still R0 of 2, right? And if you don't,
And that's what we appear to have seen in South Korea, for example, where this patient 31 infected.
But we know that super spreaders are very important.
Right.
Now you can have what we don't know is whether they're the only thing that matters. So there's a nice, very short talk between Taleb and one of his colleagues there who wrote that paper. And what Taleb said, all we need to do is get rid of the fat tail. So all we need to do is prevent super spreaders, and then the whole thing will that so much of the distribution is in that extreme numbers that when the extreme numbers are gone, the thing will just go extinct. But that may not be true. It may be that you need to get rid of those extreme events, and you need to get rid of more small scale infection. So you may have, most people infect just 1 or 2, and then you have a couple of these super spreaders. So every bit counts.
So you were
saying that's a major criticism, because it turns out if you take that into account, that random variation, the virus might actually go extinct. Whereas the models assume that the virus cannot go extinct under any circumstances. So I think they even allowed for fractional people, but that's debated. That's the problem with the source not being there, right? So one of the criticism, I think, was that you could have fractional people, which is nonsense. But then I think the Ferguson and others denied that, which is fine, but we'd like to be able to just test that.
Okay, so what you're saying is this is paper that's now being used to inform policy in the Netherlands, as well as in other countries. This makes an assumption on this R0 and the distribution of it, so how many people a person can infect, basically. And what you're saying is that their assumption doesn't take super spreaders into account enough.
Yeah, that was one of the criticisms explicitly. The model does not account for super spreaders.
Right.
And so that's why apparently they did not recommend closing festivals, because that didn't have any effect, because they didn't have super spreaders. But that's of course ridiculous.
You mean in the Netherlands?
No, in the UK.
Right. But
I think in the Netherlands they just use common sense, and they're like, yeah, we're gonna close the festivals.
Right, not based on the paper, but based on common.
Right.
So the thing is, go on.
So the thing is, you have common sense and you have a model, right? And when people do back of the napkin calculations, everybody gets angry. It's like, don't do a back of the napkin, or BVLG's coasters. Don't do that. It's like, but when there's a super sophisticated model presented by super sophisticated professors, people think it's super accurate. But it could be just as wrong as this back of the napkin calculation. It's just wrong in a way that's a little bit more difficult to understand. So you have to be just as skeptical about it. And if something in the model doesn't meet common sense, then maybe it's correct, but maybe it's wrong.
So do you think, based on this, let's assume that this critique is correct, then would it make a difference policy-wise? Is there anything wrong with the policy right now based on this misassumption? What would
the policy recommendation they make in their critique, and you have to take that with a grain of salt, I think, because they didn't do some sort of counter modeling. But what they're saying is like a very strong lockdown for a few weeks will basically crush the virus. It's kind of asymmetrical, because it can spread really fast when everybody's still connected, but as soon as everybody's in their homes, it's got nowhere to go. So it'll go down really, really fast. Mm-hmm. That's the idea. And then you want to do contact tracing, which apparently was not included in the model. Mm-hmm. So that's another critique, which is pretty critical.
Do you agree with this? Is this the way to deal with this?
Well, it sounds reasonable to me. But obviously, I don't know. But if combine that with seeing places like Taiwan and South Korea that are probably not lying about numbers, plus China that at least doesn't look like it's exploding. If China had 400 million infections today, I don't think they could hide that. They're very good at propaganda, but hiding 400 million infections, like, no way. So it sounds like, the lockdown does work in practice. And it sounds like contact tracing works because what else is keeping, what else is keeping those contagions so low in countries that don't have a lockdown, like Taiwan and Hong Kong? Now, maybe it turns out we were wrong and we get a massive outbreak in all these places. Then I just run out of ideas and we're just screwed. So I think being fatalistic, I think the main point that this critique of the paper was making is that the fatalistic assumption that a lockdown doesn't work, that is wrong. So it's kind of a double negative. It's not that lockdowns will work, it is that the evidence that lockdowns don't work, which everybody is citing, the evidence is wrong. So there is no evidence that lockdowns don't work. Does that make sense?
Hang on. The evidence.
The paper says, the Ferguson paper essentially says, if you do a lockdown, it's just going to explode afterwards. So don't bother.
Right.
That's wrong.
But why is this wrong?
It's wrong because the model that they base the conclusion on is wrong in so many ways that you should not use the model.
Okay, got it. And this
so you can throw the model away, therefore you can throw the conclusion away.
Right.
But that does not mean that lockdown does work.
Yeah, okay.
But then we have the empirical evidence that it definitely seems to work.
Right. Okay, I'm with you there. In some countries like Italy, Israel, they're getting to the point where they're implementing GPS tracking types of solutions to see who's moving where, who's meeting with who. Do you see this sort of stuff happening in the Netherlands in the near future? Do you think that's viable?
I think we have to separate two phases, right? The very short term, everything it takes to fight the virus, and then, okay, we've had our first lockdown. We don't want this to happen again. We're willing to take some measures, but, we're going to have pay much more attention to trade-offs like privacy. So in the first phase, I guess it won't, because there's right now there may be just no point if you do a lockdown anyway. Then again, maybe it's a good time to practice. So I don't know. I doubt it. I saw that Singapore had an app that at least had a privacy statement, and the privacy statement was, which I think is a good gesture, right? They could just say privacy is not important. We're at war. They said no, it is important. They said this app will track who you're meeting with, but that's only stored on the phone. And then if you are infected, then we ask you to reveal that, and we warn all these other people. So hopefully in the long run, we can have applications like that do all the tracking, but it's not centralized and it's only disclosed when it needs to be disclosed.
Yeah.
But I don't see it happening here because right now, I think the RIVM is completely overwhelmed. They're just at capacity. And so they're ignoring, they launched a site where everybody could, write down their symptoms. And that site went down within a minute and hasn't come back in 5 days, and they haven't even made a statement about it. So that tells me that you have, a limited number of employees that are completely swamped. They're probably working, 7 days a week, nonstop. And so they don't have time to hire people. They don't have time to ask for help, and they're not used to asking for help. So they're not open sourcing anything. They're not, saying, hey, this contact tracing, we need more people. Somebody maybe can help with that. That's not happening. So I don't see, that's a cultural change that doesn't happen over a few weeks.
Yeah.
My guess is we'll just do the lockdown, intelligent lockdown, and then we'll see.
Yeah. Do you actually know what's going on in the hospitals? Do you have any?
No, thank goodness I haven't been there. What's happening in the hospitals? No. From what I'm hearing in the South, is they were running frighteningly low on capacity, and the hospitals outside in the other provinces were initially reluctant to accept patients, but they were asked nicely to change their minds. And so as of a few days ago, there were transports, ambulance transports and military transports to get as many patients as far north as possible, because the spread there, the outbreak there is very small. So the idea is just to move people away. And then they still have plenty of capacity, but I think they're about at halfway capacity.
Yeah.
That is maybe to politicians not scary, but to anybody who understands exponential growth, that is 3 days away from disaster.
Yeah.
at any moment. And so if it doesn't go up, yay. But if it does go up, you've got 3 days to double your capacity. And then it could just go up again by a factor 3 or a factor 5 in a few days.
Yeah.
That's the randomness. That's also why the herd immunity doesn't work, because if you somehow want to linearly, titrate the entire population through this virus, you can't control it. So you'd have to aim at, say, 50 emergency beds being used at any time, and then have 1,000 that are unused, just in case you fuck up and you get exponential growth for a few weeks, and you're like, oops, now we're at the maximum again. And then you have to do a lockdown, and then, okay, now we're at 50 again. Let's continue it at 50. And you have to do that for 200 years or some crazy number. So if you really think it through, it just doesn't make any sense. But if you just see a paper by really fancy people with some nice charts in it, then maybe it looks convincing.
Yes, that's my impression as well. They're magnitudes off from what's safe.
It's the same with architects, right? The new buildings always look really fancy on the computer when you're looking at it from a drone, and the buildings are floating and don't have an entrance. And yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, they're actually driving buses now through the Netherlands. I know if you heard this, like like public transport types of buses, but they're ambulance buses.
Okay.
And they're using the helicopters now. There's anything with wheels or with wings to drive sick people around is being.
Yeah, I think they know what they're doing, and they have help from the military, and the military is used to this sort of stuff. So they're good at improvising. That's what they do. So
Yeah.
I'm not worried about that. I mean, as long as they don't run out of capacity, I think the hospitals will do a fine job. But it's not up to the hospitals to make sure they don't run out of capacity.
Yeah. How do you see Bitcoin act in all of this? Do you see we've so far only spoken about the virus itself, but of course the economy is going wild. The money, the printer is going burr.
So I've always sort of expected that at some point the economic system would come crashing down. Timing is really bad. I would have preferred this to happen at some random time when there was no pandemic, but something's got to trigger it. So when I look at that type of collapse and the response from central banks, I'm kind of ignoring it, because it's like, yeah, this was supposed to happen at some point. And also, it's just not the biggest, for me, it's not the biggest deal. Like, I would like to get this virus under control and worry about the economy later. And central banks have been amazing at kicking the can down the road. People said in 2007, this thing is going to collapse. And, it almost collapsed. And then they just did something really stupid. We didn't solve the problem, but everybody could ignore it again for 12 years. So I kind of have faith in the ability of central banks and others to keep this game of pretends going for a little bit longer. And then when the pandemic is under control, then let the whole thing crash. That's fine, but not now. As for Bitcoin, the price dropped by less than half during the worst market event ever, basically. Not just in Bitcoin's history, just ever since maybe the 1920s.
It might have.
So it could have vaporized. Yeah, I expected, if something this big happens, maybe it just evaporates, which is nice. Then you can buy it really cheap. So I think it did well, but we don't know. It might still go down, might still go up. I'm not a price predictor, magician. Technically, though, as far as I can see, it doesn't care. It just blocks are produced, transactions move, nodes still work. So that's good news. At least it doesn't add any headaches. It'd be really annoying if we had some sort of contentious hard fork like right now.
Yeah, I think we might see central bank digital currencies soon as well. They're trying everything at this point.
Yeah, but those things are not I don't understand why people are so hyped up about that. They're just bank accounts with the central bank with some pseudo fake blockchain cargo cult thing.
No, I agree.
Extremely uninteresting. Yeah.
Well, it could allow governments to print even more money even easier.
I think weren't they minting $2 trillion coins?
Yes.
Well, why would you need an easier way to print money than making $2 trillion coins?
Yeah, it doesn't get much
I think we've had money printing technology for a long time. I mean, they tried it in Weimar. It was not, didn't work too well, but they can do it.
Yeah, well, that's the next question, right? We have Bitcoin now, so can they do it?
Yes, and the biggest problem is that I'd rather not have the whole thing collapse for yet another reason, is that if you have an outbreak like this, your rights are not very strong, to put it mildly. So in any circumstances, when a government collapses, they're going to try and confiscate money. But if it happens during a pandemic, they're going to try even harder to confiscate money. So this is a really bad time for Bitcoin to like go to values where Bitcoin has become an interesting target.
Yeah, well, I would say it's not only governments are going to try even harder, but the general public might be even more in favor of it because,
Especially if people start gloating about it. Like I'm not on Twitter celebrating the Bitcoin price. I think that's weird.
right.
But if people do, they're making themselves a target. Because if the whole thing goes to shit and you start bragging how rich you are, it's not a good idea.
Yeah,
For ethical reasons, but also for practical reasons.
I agree with that. All right, is there anything else we need to discuss before we call an end to this?
No, I wanted to say one positive thing about the Dutch measures. I like that they're really trying to keep it decentralized. So they didn't say everybody's now locked in their houses. They basically said dear mayors of every city, keep people 1.5 meters away from each other. You figure out how. Here are some things you're allowed to do, and if you need to do more, give us a call. Which I think is quite nice because in the center of Amsterdam, I'm sure you need very different measures than in some remote little village. Where people don't even talk to each other, so you don't need any measures.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. My main issue with the Dutch government is the false information, and the policy is one thing. They should be transparent and no more misinformation, and that's what bothers me.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to get any better because these communication employees and whatever they're busy, so they're not going to change strategy all of a sudden.
Yeah.
This whole like paternalistic way of communicating is super annoying. They're like, trust us, we're the experts. And if you ask them specific questions, they're like, well, I don't know, I'd have to ask the expert. It's just literally like how you have to ask Vitalik or some. I want to be able to ask a question, and I don't have to get an answer, but I do have to get like say, hey, you should ask this person, or you should look at this document, rather than say, no, trust us, computer says this.
Yes, I totally agree.
It's terrible, especially when the experts are wrong on at least some really important things. Maybe not on everything, but they're definitely wrong. So you can't defer to them.
Yeah, don't trust verify, Sjors.
Yep. Sounds
All
good.
Right. Thanks, and I'll see you soon sometime, somewhere. Cheers.